more now with Aaron Zalin. He's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he also directs the Islamic State Worldwide Activity Map Project. It's a really interesting date, this decade since the Islamic State group proclaimed its caliphate. What kind of threat do you think the group poses now after those 10 years?
Thanks for having me. It's a different kind of threat than it was 10 years ago, since they don't control territory the size of the UK between Iraq and Syria. However, they do have territorial control now in small pockets in 4 different African countries. And while the external operations capacities is definitely down compared to what we saw with the wave of attacks, especially in Europe from 2014 to 2017, we've seen an increase of attacks coming from IS's branch in Afghanistan in the last year or two that increasingly is coming closer to the West now.
Yeah, I mean, what does the group actually look like? You mentioned its center of power is no longer in Iraq and Syria. It's now really mostly in Africa. What does this group look like? Does it have a leadership? What kind of capabilities does it have?
Yeah, it essentially just restructured itself after the fall of its territorial control in Iraq and Syria in 2019, where the Iraq and Syria branch kind of were at the top of everything. Now it's kind of considered equal to the other so-called provinces, which is what they call their different branches all over. And therefore, it's a bit more integrated, and the designation of power is spread more across different places. So we see them being involved in governance still, just like in Iraq and Syria, but now it's happening in Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, and Mozambique instead. And instead of the external operations targeting the West coming from Syria, they're mainly coming out of Afghanistan right now.
Yeah, and that was the group, wasn't it? Correct me if I'm wrong, but ISIS-K that claimed responsibility for that attack in Moscow on a concert venue a few months ago. It killed around 140 people. How dangerous is that group? It seemed like it really took Russia a bit off guard.
Yeah, no, it's definitely the biggest threat outside of sort of its war zone. We've seen it increasingly spread its regional and global ambitions, where previously primarily focused on just Afghanistan or Pakistan, and maybe a cross-border attack against Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, where in the last year or so we've seen increasing plots as well as attacks, not just as we saw in Russia, but also in Iran earlier this year, as well as in Turkey. And there have been a number of plots broken up in Western Europe as well, especially in Germany. So, one of the biggest questions right now is if they'll actually succeed in doing something in Europe.
We saw in 2019 the U.S. Killed its former leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. What does the leadership structure of IS look like now? Is there an actual leader?
Yes, there is. Abu Hafs is the leader now, though at least publicly speaking, we don't know who he is or his real name. It's plausible that people within, the government or intelligence agencies might know his actual identity, but at least publicly, we still don't know who he is, and he's now been in charge of the group for about a year and a half or so.
It's really interesting. We're sitting here, 10 years after the proclamation of this caliphate, asking questions like, who is the leader of ISIS? When back then it was one of the biggest global threats to peace and stability across the world. I mean, how should we assess the legacy now of the so-called Islamic State and the way that this group and kind of the war on terror in general changed the world?
Well, I think it changed a lot of things. One, it inspired a whole new generation of individuals to get involved in the broader jihadi movement. It also split up with Al-Qaeda, which sort of changed the way that we view the jihadist movement in general. And then it's been able to spread to many different parts of the world. So while, the threat within Iraq and Syria is, of course, not as much as it had been, 5 to 10 years ago, we've seen it spread to other locations, and therefore, even if it's not on the daily news, it's continuing from its perspective to advance, because for them, their goals aren't just for Iraq and Syria, it's global. So long as they continue to have any breath from their perspective, they see themselves as being able to continue on in their vision.
Really interesting stuff. Aaron Zalin, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he also directs the Islamic State Worldwide Activity Map Project. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.